When two former Christian prelates, as internationally prominent as Desmond Tutu and George Carey, called for the legalization of voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, their arguments merit careful consideration. My talk outlines and evaluates their arguments. My remarks are based on a forthcoming paper in the journal Christian Bioethics, so here I'll simply summarize that paper. In most countries, it remains a serious crime for a doctor intentionally to administer a lethal injection at a suffering patient's request, that is, voluntary active euthanasia, or VAE, or to provide a patient with a lethal drug that's later self-administered, that is, physician-assisted suicide, or PAS. However, since the mid-1980s, several jurisdictions have permitted VAE and or PAS, and campaigns to relax the law in many others have intensified. Those campaigns would be boosted were major faith traditions such as Anglicanism to drop their historic opposition. Campaigners have therefore welcomed the recent conversion to their cause of two former Anglican prelates, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town and Nobel Peace Laureate, and Lord George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. My talk outlines Desmond Tutu's and George Carey's case for legalization and then questions the force of their case, considering a number of counter-arguments. By the end of this presentation, everyone should have a good grasp of the main contours of the ongoing debate on this important question, or what Lord Judge, the former Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, has described in the foreword to my book, Euthanasia, Ethics and Public Policy, as the great moral and legal problem of our times. First, Desmond Tutu. In 2014, he explained his support for what he termed assisted dying. I avoid the phrase assisted dying because it's euphemistic, tendentious and vague. Some use it to mean VAE and PAS, others only to mean PAS. Tutu wrote that dying is part of life, and talking about it should not be taboo. People should die a decent death, being able to say goodbye to loved ones, if possible at home. Doctors needed better training in end-of-life care. He did not want his life to be artificially prolonged. He did not want a feeding tube or a ventilator. I don't want people to do their damnedest to keep me alive, he said. He would not mind having an assisted death. Tutu invoked the case of a man called Craig, who had struggled with neurofibromatosis for 28 years and had decided his quality of life was too poor. He killed himself by taking sleeping pills and putting plastic bags over his head. He had wanted to end his life with lawful assistance, listening to his favourite music and in the embrace of his parents. Tutu continued that he revered the sanctity of life, but not at any cost. Several jurisdictions had made the option of a hastened death legally available, including the Netherlands, Oregon, and Switzerland. In 2016, he repeated his call for legalization. He observed he had argued firmly for compassion and fairness in life, and terminally ill people should be treated with the same compassion and fairness when it came to their death. He wrote, dying people should have the right to choose how and when they leave Mother Earth. He noted that the law had been relaxed in California and Canada. Why, he asked, are so many instead forced to endure terrible pain and suffering against their wishes? In refusing dying people the right to die with dignity, we fail to demonstrate the compassion that lay at the heart of Christianity. He noted that his friend, Lord Carey, also supported legalization. In articles published in 2014 and 2015, Lord Carey explained why he had changed his mind to support legalization of PAS, and it appeared VAE. Medical science offered people the chance to be kept alive far longer than would have been possible only a few years ago. Yet the law had not caught up with science and remained trapped in the past, badly out of kilter with the real needs of society, and risked undermining the efforts of families and doctors to care for and ease the pain and misery of people reaching the end of their lives. The arguments that in the past led him to oppose legalization, that we should devote ourselves to caring, not killing, and the risk of slippery slopes, now lacked power when confronted with the experiences of those suffering a painful death. The case of Tony, a man with locked-in syndrome who had unsuccessfully sought judicial approval for a lethal injection, had led his lordship to question his previous views. Another case was that of a woman, Joan, who had written to him to recount how she had assisted the suicide of her friend, Margaret, who suffered from multiple sclerosis. One of the key themes of the Bible, moreover, was love for one's fellow human beings, and Jesus' mission was underpinned by compassion. The Church accepted the use of morphine to ease pain, which might occasionally also have the effect of hastening death. So why not extend this to give the dying a choice over how and when they end their lives? There must, he added, be safeguards. It would be outrageous if it were extended beyond the terminally ill to an ever-widening group of people, including the disabled and the depressed. Such a step would impose terrible pressures on some of the most vulnerable members of society. It would also conjure up the nightmare image of official death panels that could decide the fate of individuals, as the sinister ideological eugenicists of the 20th century advocated. The need for caution was also, he wrote, shown by the Netherlands, where there were thousands of cases of VAE and PAS every year. Dutch ethicist Professor Theo Boer, who had served for several years on one of the Dutch Euthanasia review committees, had warned of a surge in the number of deaths if the British followed the Dutch. There was also, noted Carey, a move in the Netherlands to allow anyone over 70 who felt tired of life to be assisted in suicide. This was certainly disturbing. But, he added, it should be remembered that the overwhelming number of cases in the Netherlands involved terminally ill cancer patients. Any legalization in Britain must be accompanied by powerful safeguards and a great improvement in palliative care. Although the hospice movement had improved, access to hospice care remained something of a lottery. That then is a broad outline of the case for legalization advanced by Desmond Tutu and George Carey. Many will find it persuasive, but many will not. Why not? There are at least 3 reasons. First, much of their case is of limited or of no relevance to the legalization of VA and PAS and concerns matters that are ethically uncontroversial. Surely no one would disagree with Desmond Tutu that talking about death should not be taboo, that doctors should be better trained in end-of-life care, that people should die a decent death, bidding farewell to loved ones if possible at home, and that doctors should not always do their damnedest to keep patients alive. And the fact that, as George Carey pointed out, advances in medical science allow life to be prolonged, does not mean that life should therefore be prolonged. Professional medical ethics and the Christian moral tradition have long held that human life is not the supreme good, that it's not the role of doctors to preserve life at all costs, that the patient has the primary responsibility to make decisions in relation to his or her health and treatment. One may agree that patients have a right to make decisions about their medical treatment, and that life need not be preserved at all costs, without agreeing that it's ethical intentionally to kill patients or intentionally to help patients kill themselves. A second reason many may find their case unpersuasive is that neither of them demonstrated an accurate understanding of the meaning and significance of the principle of the sanctity or inviolability of life to which they referred. Tutu wrote that he revered the sanctity of life, but not at any cost. He seemed, like Carey, to think that the sanctity of life requires the preservation of life at all costs, but this is to confuse the sanctity of life with vitalism. They should have acknowledged that the sanctity or inviolability of life does not require the preservation of life at all costs, but it does prohibit the intentional shortening of life. That the principle has historically lain at the core of professional medical ethics, the criminal law, and Christian ethics, and that it's grounded in the recognition that each human being enjoys an equal and ineliminable dignity, a dignity that is intrinsic and is not diminished by illness or disability. As this dignity is ineliminable, it is never lost, even if one finds oneself in undignified circumstances. neither Tutu nor Carey noted this significant distinction between inherent human dignity, which patients never lose, and the undignified circumstances in which they may sometimes find themselves. A much fuller explanation of the concept of dignity has of course been undertaken by Professor Sultmasi in this symposium. This idea of a fundamental equality and dignity that rules out the intentional killing of certain patients was nicely captured in the report of the distinguished interdisciplinary House of Lords Select Committee on Medical Ethics in 1994. That committee unanimously rejected the case for legalization. The committee described the prohibition on intentional killing as the cornerstone of law and of social relationships that protects each one of us impartially, embodying the belief that all are equal. Tutu and Carey, by contrast, seem to buy into the contrary idea that some patients lack intrinsic dignity, that they would be better off dead, and that it's right intentionally to kill them or intentionally to help them kill themselves. That support for VAE-PAS is grounded in the belief that the lives of certain patients are not worth living, was underlined by another former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in his speech in the House of Lords opposing a bill to permit PAS. Lord Williams said, "Whether or not you believe that God enters into consideration, it remains true that to specify conditions under which it would be both reasonable and legal to end your life is to say that certain kinds of human life are not worth living. As soon as this is publicly granted, we put at risk the security of all who experience such conditions. That this is not an abstract matter or a matter concocted for scaremongering purposes by sinister prelates," he added, ought to be evident from what had been said by the Disability Rights Commission and the Association of Sufferers from Motor Neurone Disease. Similarly, the joint submission of the Anglican and Catholic bishops of the UK to the Lords Select Committee noted that all human beings are to be valued, irrespective of age, sex, race, religion, social status, or potential for achievement. They added that although the prohibition on intentionally killing the innocent is absolute, life is not an absolute or supreme value, and it's perfectly proper to administer palliative drugs even if they incidentally shorten life. Referring to the ethical principle of double effect, they stated, "There is a proper and fundamental ethical distinction between that which is intended and that which is foreseen but unintended." In short, neither Tutu nor Carey seemed properly to grasp the idea that the prohibition on intentional killing is grounded in a recognition of fundamental human equality, not in a belief that human life must be preserved at all costs. And Lord Carey failed to see the distinction endorsed not only by professional medical ethics, the criminal law, and the Christian moral tradition, between intentionally killing the patient and intentionally killing the pain by administering morphine, even if it should, as a rare side effect, foreseeably shorten life. Tutu and Carey's concern to relieve human suffering is laudable, but opponents of legalization also strongly support equitable access to quality palliative care. Never before have healthcare professionals been better able to palliate pain and suffering, and palliative care experts are, moreover, at the forefront of opposition to legalization. Even leading advocates of VAE-PAS have recognised that pain can be adequately palliated in the vast majority of cases, and that in rare cases of refractory pain, there is the option of sedation to unconsciousness. Moreover, Tutu and Carey seem oblivious to the reality that in jurisdictions with permissive laws, pain is far from the main reason for accessing VAE or PAS. In Oregon, for example, the two most common reasons for accessing PAS are losing autonomy and a decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable. Carey wrote that access to palliative care in the UK was something of a lottery. But why is this not a reason to improve access to palliative care rather than to legalise VAE-PAS, which would surely be resorted to by some, wholly or partly, because of inadequate access to palliative care? Let's now turn, thirdly, to Tutu and Carey's failure to engage at all adequately with the two slippery slope arguments against legalization. The case for legalization advanced by the two former prelates is vulnerable to both slippery slope arguments, the logical argument and the empirical argument. First, let us consider the logical implications of their arguments for legalization. Even if Lord Carey supports only PAS, if he thinks it's justifiable in the case of a terminally ill patient who is able to end their life with assistance, why does he not support VAE in the case of a person who is physically unable to end their life with assistance? Moreover, remember he wrote it would be outrageous if a relaxed bill were to apply to those who are not terminally ill. But why? If PAS and VAE are justified in the case of the terminally ill, why not in the case of the chronically ill, who will have longer to suffer and who may be suffering more severely? What about their autonomy and dignity? If compassion is to be our moral guide, why should compassion for those who have longer to suffer not justify their termination? Indeed, neither Tutu nor Carey seem to realise that the real-life cases they invoke to bolster their arguments, Craig, Margaret and Tony, in fact undermined it. Neurofibromatosis, multiple sclerosis and locked-in syndrome are not terminal conditions. Further, why does compassion for those who are suffering but not competent, such as infants or those with advanced dementia, not justify their termination? Why should compassion be confined to the competent? The logical slippery slope argument holds that endorsement of voluntary euthanasia entails endorsement of non-voluntary euthanasia, the intentional termination of incompetent patients. As we noted earlier, the moral case for VAE rests on the premise that certain patients would be better off dead. For it's not merely the patient's request that's thought to justify euthanasia, but also the doctor's judgment that the patient's request should be granted because death would benefit the patient. And if the doctor can make that judgment in the case of a suffering, competent patient, the doctor can, logically, make it in the case of a suffering, incompetent patient. If a hastened death would benefit a patient, why should the doctor deny that benefit, merely because the patient is incapable of requesting it? In short, the absence of autonomy does not cancel the duty of beneficence. Tutu and Carey's rather simplistic reliance on compassion as a moral guide is, moreover, doubly problematic. Not only does compassion regard limitations such as terminal illness or competence as arbitrary, but compassion is not a moral principle. It's a sympathetic feeling for the suffering of others, combined with a desire to alleviate that suffering. But sympathetic feeling will not tell us what course of action is ethical or unethical. People's feelings often lead them morally astray. The second slippery slope argument, the empirical or practical argument, runs that it's practically impossible to draft and enforce sufficiently precise and strict guidelines to ensure effective legal control of VAE or PAS, and to prevent abuse and mistake. How, for example, is one to ensure that a patient's suffering is truly unbearable, and that there is no reasonable alternative, or that the requests are truly voluntary and informed, and not the result of depression, or of pressure, overt or subtle, from relatives, or as a result of socio-cultural expectations? In 2014, Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, challenged Lord Carey's support for a PAS bill, responded to Carey's argument from compassion, and warned of the real danger of abuse. Welby wrote that the view that the bill was the only truly compassionate response that a civilised society could make to the terminally ill who wanted to end their own lives was mistaken and dangerous. The argument from compassion was deeply flawed. The word compassion meant to suffer with, and the problem with the argument was not that it failed to show compassion, but that it showed too little. It restricted compassion to the immediate and the personal, instead of extending it to everybody. It failed to recognise the truth of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that everyone is my neighbour, and everyone deserves my compassion. The deep personal demands of one situation should not blind us to the wider needs of others. There were many people who suffered every day, including vulnerable people, often elderly or disabled. It was estimated that more than 500,000 elderly were abused each year in the UK, mostly by relatives and often for financial gain. Compassion should be extended to those people when thinking about the smaller number of people who want to be assisted to end their lives. It would be very naive, he added, to think that many of the elderly who are neglected and abused would not be put under pressure to end their lives if the law were relaxed. Even absent overt pressure, the very existence of a relaxed law would be bound to lead sensitive individuals to stop being a burden to others. He asked, what sort of society would we be creating if we were to allow this sword of Damocles to hang over the head of every vulnerable, terminally ill person in the country? True compassion, a commitment to sharing in the suffering of others while trying to alleviate it, was shown by caring for others, spending time and resources on them, and by offering hope even in the darkest circumstances. Compassion could not be shown by the sort of discrimination that elevated one person's experience, however dear she may be, above the experience of many others. That was not only his view, he said, it was the long-established view of the Church of England and almost all other churches and faith traditions, as well as numerous groups representing the vulnerable. Nor are Lord Welby's concerns about the dangers of legalisation fanciful. Even Lord Carey, we recall, recognised concerns about euthanasia in the Netherlands. The Dutch Supreme Court declared VA and PS lawful in 1984, and several comprehensive government-sponsored surveys of end-of-life decision-making have been carried out since at regular intervals. Illustrating the logical slippery slope argument, in 1996, the Dutch courts proceeded to declare non-voluntary euthanasia lawful in the case of disabled infants. And illustrating the unfeasibility of effective legal control, those Dutch surveys have shown that doctors have over the years, in breach of the guidelines, failed to report thousands of cases to the review committees, and in thousands of cases have intentionally administered lethal injections to patients without an explicit request. Lord Carey mentioned that Professor Boer, a former review committee member, had warned of the likely surge in the number of cases if British law were to be relaxed. But that has not been Boer's only warning. He has detailed the normalisation of euthanasia in his country and the elastic interpretation of the guidelines to justify euthanasia in cases going way beyond dying patients suffering severe pain to include the mentally ill, patients in the early stage of dementia, and, on the basis of an advance directive, those with advanced dementia. He's described several cases approved by the review committees, including a grandmother with failing sight who was euthanized because she would no longer be able to see her grandchildren, an autistic man who had lost his job and was unlikely to find another, and a case of duo euthanasia, where a couple was euthanized, the first because of a terminal illness, the second because they'd been cared for by the first and did not wish to live without them. It's surprising that Lord Carey, being aware of Professor Boer's concerns, and of the Dutch government's proposal in 2016 to permit elderly people over a particular age to obtain assistance in suicide on the ground that their life is completed, nevertheless supports proposals that would surely lead Britain down the same path. Conclusion. It's often claimed that the case against legalisation is religious. Such claims, though sadly typical in the superficial and slanted coverage of this important issue by the mass media, are false. Not only can religious figures be found on both sides of the debate, as we've just seen, but even leading Christian opponents of legalisation, like Lord Williams and Lord Welby, have invoked moral rather than theological arguments, as we've also just seen. And of course, purely secular organisations, like the World Medical Association and leading disability groups, do not support legalisation. As for Desmond Tutu and George Carey, though clearly inspired by compassion for the suffering dying, their case for legalisation is vulnerable to at least three counter-arguments. First, a substantial portion of their case concerns morally uncontroversial matters irrelevant to legalisation. Second, they appear to misunderstand the principle of the inviolability of life and its basis. Third, they fail to engage at all adequately with the two slippery slope arguments against legalization, the logical and the empirical. I hope this talk has offered a helpful overview of some of the main contours of this important ethical, legal and political debate. If you wish to explore the issue further, the literature is vast. But a useful starting point is the short book Debating Euthanasia by Hart Publishing. Aimed at the general reader, it contains an essay for and an essay against legalization. It also contains helpful recommendations for further reading.